I am Lauren Peretti, and I am joined this morning by my colleagues, Howard Birchman and Sarah Zeiderveen, and we are from Housing Innovations, and we are a training and consulting firm. We have been working, providing supports to continuums of care like yours around the country for several decades. Many of you hopefully know Howard on our team. He's the person who works most closely with your COC, and we are with you this morning to talk about the housing requirements in rapid rehousing and joint transitional rapid rehousing continuum of care projects. So we are going to be doing a similar session later this month on the 28th that's going to really focus on permanent supportive housing projects. So if you are from a PSH project rather than a joint or rapid rehousing project, feel free to hop off and join us again on the 28th, which will be, as I said, focused more on PSH. So today's session is part of a series of trainings that the Rhode Island Continuum of Care is offering for you all. And each of these sessions is being recorded and is available on the COC's YouTube channel. And there is a link to that channel in the slides later on in today's presentation. So before we get started, we just want to do a couple of quick housekeeping things. Most importantly, we absolutely invite you to speak up, make comments, ask questions at any time, right? No one wants to listen to Howard and I talk for 2 hours straight. So please, please, please join the conversation. Don't wait for us to prompt for questions or pause, right? Literally at any time, unmute, start talking. Put things in the chat. We invite as much participation as possible. If you are feeling camera ready this morning and would like to turn your camera on, that would be great. We love being able to see you. Sarah will, I think, upload the slides into the chat momentarily if she hasn't already. And we know some of you have had technical issues using the Zoom polls. We're sorry about that. If you are having a technical issue, don't worry, just sit tight. We will review all the answers together. You can try, if you logged in using the Teams app, to log out and rather log in using the browser instead. But that may or may not work for you, but that's an option you can try. And we are going to be together today for 2 hours. So we will be sure to end by noon at the latest, if not earlier than that. So before we jump in, we know that this content can be a little dry, all of this HUD rules stuff. And so we like to kick off with something a little bit more fun, and also for you guys to get to see who is with us today in the room and for us to see who is with us in the room. So if you wouldn't mind taking a minute and just putting in the chat box a brief introduction. So your name, what agency you're with, what your job is at your agency, where you're located in the state of Rhode Island, and what you like to do in the fall. So for me, autumn is perfect hiking weather, and I absolutely love to be in the woods with my pups during the fall. So I'll give folks a minute to get that information into the chat. I see people typing, and just share some of the things that folks are putting in there. I am seeing people typing, but I'm not seeing. Howard or Sarah, can you see actual responses that are going in? There we go. So we've got apple picking. We've got some apple picking. Pumpkin anything. So eating all of the delicious pumpkin flavors that come out in the fall. So keep going, getting those things in there. And we've got a lot of votes for apple picking here. So, and also decorating the porch for the fall. Oh, and I love this one too, food trucks at fall festivals. So, all right, thanks everybody. Keep that going, and I'm going to move us on to our agenda. So this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about what things you need to make sure are in place when someone first comes into your program, what things you need to make sure are in place when you are looking for units and then approving units to get assisted with COC dollars, We're going to talk about the leasing requirements in both rental assistance and projects that are using the leasing budget line item. Then I'm going to turn it over to Howard. He's going to talk about income verification and rent and subsidy calculations. He's going to talk about requirements that apply when you are recertifying somebody for assistance. He's going to talk about circumstances in which people should be hopefully retaining their assistance. And then when folks are exiting the program, what are the requirements that apply at project exit? So I just wanted to say a few words about why all of this matters, right? Why should we care about this? So the first thing is that a bunch of the stuff that we're going to talk about today is important because the requirements really are intended to protect the rights of the people that we serve. So for example, we want to make sure that people have decent quality housing, right? And we're going to talk about housing quality standards and the new NSPIRE standards. We also want to make sure that, there are certain protections that people are afforded in a lease or an occupancy agreement. And we want to make sure that those things are in place to establish those contractual rights for folks. The other reason why this stuff is important, because on some of the content that we cover today, most of the content we cover today, were your COC or HUD to come out and monitor your project. If you didn't do some of these things, that would be a monitoring finding. And in some cases, it could be a recapture risk. So when HUD monitors, mostly when they have a finding, they're going to ask you to correct that finding. But for certain types of findings, they can actually require you to pay the money back to the federal government. So for example, if you were paying rental assistance on a unit and didn't have a lease to back up that payment, that could be a recapture risk. And obviously, none of us ever want to see that happen. So, all right, so we're going to talk first about the things that apply when you are moving someone new into your project. And always, Howard and Sarah and I do quite a bit of monitoring for the COCs that we support. And always the biggest recapture risk that we see when we monitor is people either not having any eligibility documentation in a participant files, or having some documentation, but documentation that doesn't quite meet the HUD standards. So definitely the most important thing that you need to do when you are admitting somebody into your project is to review their eligibility documentation and make sure that you have evidence that they are in fact eligible for your program. If you do not have such evidence in your files, HUD can actually recapture all of the money back to when the person originally entered your project. So for rapid rehousing, that isn't quite as big of a deal as it is for permanent supportive housing, but we definitely want to make sure that we have that documentation so that we don't have to send any money back to the federal government. We're not going to go through the details on eligibility documentation today. TAC did a webinar on that, and the link on that webinar is here on this slide. So next thing we're going to talk about is grievances. So, when a person that you're serving is dissatisfied for whatever reason with the assistance that they are getting from your COC project, they have a right to file a grievance. And a grievance process isn't going to help anyone, right, if they don't know that it exists. And so we want to make sure that when people are entering projects, that we are giving them a written notice that explains to them that they have the right to file a grievance, how they would file a grievance, and how they can get help with that process, right? So particularly if your process has any kind of written element, right, people have to fill out a form or put something in writing, some folks are going to need help to be able to do that, and you want to make sure that they know that they can ask for that help without any kind of repercussions. And then you also want to tell them how quickly they can expect to hear back from you. Now, this notice is not a HUD requirement, but it is really a best practice in managing these programs. And, we like to think about grievances really as an opportunity, right, to learn about and improve things that are not working particularly well for the people we serve. And so we really try to see grievances as part of our efforts to continuously make projects better rather than just as an administrative requirement. All right. So the other thing that you want to make sure you do when people are coming in is to have them sign releases of information authorizing you to share personal information about them at a need-to-know basis. So that includes both an HMIS release that authorizes you to put data about folks into your HMIS system, as well as whatever release your individual agency uses to authorize any sharing outside of HMIS that you're going to be doing with collateral contacts. And, sometimes when we monitor, we see releases that are very generic and don't include the kind of specific information that they should include, right? So you really want to make sure that your releases are quite specific, right? That they say, to whom the participant is authorizing you to release the information, what they're authorizing you to release, how that information is going to be used, when the authorization expires, and that they have the right to rescind that authorization at any time without it impacting the services that they receive. So remember that even though we're going to ask everyone to authorize us to release information as needed, that granting that authorization is voluntary for the participant, right? So people have the right to say no, and we're going to continue to serve them regardless of whether or not they've given us that authorization. So we talked about this in a previous webinar that Howard and I did. VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act, and it establishes certain rights for all domestic violence survivors. It's a little bit of a misnomer. It establishes those rights regardless of the gender of the survivor. And we covered a lot of different information about the VAWA requirements in the policy and administrative requirements webinar that we did. So that is linked at the bottom right-hand side of this slide. So if you missed it, check that out. For today, we just wanted to give a reminder that when somebody's entering the project, right, and at the other times that are listed here, you've got to provide participants with both the notice of occupancy right and the incident certification form. And again, those two forms are linked here at the top of the slide. In the slides, any place where you see green highlighted and underlined text, that is a hyperlink. So again, you have to give these notices to all adults in the household, right? So not just the head of household. We want to give it to all adults because we don't know, what dynamics might exist among folks that, the information may not be shared. And you want to give it regardless of whether or not you think there's any domestic violence happening in the household or not, because we just don't know, right? So, and you want to do that, give both of these forms at project entry. Anytime that assistance is denied, when a landlord is evicting someone, they should be giving the notices with the eviction notice. And then anytime you as the grant recipient are terminating assistance, you also need to give the notices anytime you're terminating assistance. And Howard will talk about that later on in the presentation. All right. So now we're going to talk about the things that you need to do when you are looking for units and then approving units to be assisted with COC funds. And the first thing, of course, is helping people to find a unit that they can rent, right? So participants are not responsible in the COC program for finding their own unit, right? Staff are really the ones that are responsible for doing that hard work to build those relationships with landlords and provide whatever assistance people need in order to locate a suitable unit as quickly as possible. And so, as part of that process, it's important to explore what's going to work for people and what's not going to work for people in terms of a unit, right? Where do they want to live? Who do they want to live with? Who do they want to live near? Who do they not want to live near, right? Are they able to use stairs? There are a lot of exploration needs to happen around what somebody's housing preferences are, which of those preferences are negotiable and which are non-negotiable. And there's a tool linked here that your teams can use for that purpose if it's helpful. This is not a HUD requirement or a COC requirement that you use that tool. It's just a resource in case you find it helpful. And then, of course, when we are helping people to find a rapid rehousing unit, the subsidy is only going to be time limited, right? Usually, in most COCs, rapid rehousing assistance is, for 12 months at the most. It's never going to be for more than 24 months. And so people have to be able to afford the unit that they're leasing when the assistance ends. And so, looking at what their employment history is, what their income goals are, and making sure that the unit that you are leasing is going to be affordable to them and a good fit for them when the assistance ends. All right. So I think I skipped a slide accidentally here. Sorry. All right. So NSPIRE, people may or may not be familiar. It's a new inspection process that reportedly eventually will replace HQS, but HUD has not yet released the guidance that we need in order to use NSPIRE in COC projects. And so as a result, they keep extending the deadline. So most recently, HUD issued the notice that is linked here on this slide, and it extends the deadline to comply with the NSPIRE standards for about a year or so to October 1st of 2026. In the meantime, you should continue to use housing quality standards. When we do eventually roll out NSPIRE in the COC program nationally, the goal really is for it to be an easier process, right? So it's fewer standards than HQS. It's things that are more focused on health and safety rather than on appearance. And because there is, in some cases, the ability for landlords to self-inspect, it will mean that your staff have to do less going out to inspect units. Again, we are awaiting HUD guidance in order to enable rollout of this throughout the COC program nationally. So in the meantime, as I said, you should, if you are not using NSPIRE, which most COC programs are not because staff have not been trained on how to use it, you should continue to use the HQS inspections in the meantime. And so that inspection form is linked here on this slide. And the requirement is that you inspect all of the units that are being assisted with rental assistance or leasing dollars, and that inspection occurs prior to you leasing the unit, so prior to occupancy and prior to you starting to pay money, COC money for that unit, and then every 12 months thereafter. And it's important to remember sometimes when we monitor, we see problems that are noted on the HQS inspection form, but then the payment starts, right? So you find a problem, you notify the landlord of the problem, but then you're paying on the unit anyway. And that's not allowable, right? So the unit has to actually pass inspection in order for you to begin the assistance. There's no specific requirement from HUD on who's qualified to do HQS inspections, although it is a good idea to get staff trained on that if you can. There are a number of vendors nationally that offer that training. It is important, and this is a potential recapture risk, that you've got for every unit that you're paying rent on, that you've got an HQS inspection form documenting that the unit has been inspected in the last 12 months. And the costs associated with those inspections, so travel costs to go to the unit, the time that your staff spend doing those inspections, those are eligible on the rental assistance or the leasing budget line item. They are not eligible supportive services expenses. So that is also a common finding, that programs are charging those expenses to the supportive services budget line item. And unfortunately, those are not eligible supportive service expenses. So a couple of other quick things on housing quality inspections. So there's a link here to the acceptability criteria, so that document can help your staff to determine whether or not they should approve a unit. And you want to make sure that the HQS form is signed by whomever inspected it and dated, and that it indicates the address and the unit number that was inspected, and that address and unit number matches the lease, right? That's how someone who is monitoring would know that, in fact, you have inspected the correct unit. And then lastly, you want to make sure that if lead-based paint visual inspection is applicable, that it is documented on the HQS form that you in fact did the lead-based paint visual inspection. So, and that basically, what's applicable for lead-based paint is units that are constructed prior to 1978, right? So at some point in the history of our country, we realized that lead is terrible for people and we stopped using it in paint. So you don't have to worry about lead-based paint visual inspections for any units constructed after 1978. But for units constructed before 1978, before they are occupied, you need to do that visual inspection if the unit is going to be housing someone who is pregnant or a child under the age of 6. And we know that exposure to lead paint has really serious health consequences, and it is especially dangerous for young children and folks who are pregnant. So this is another place where it's not just about, checking the box for HUD, the compliance box. It really is important measure to make sure that the folks that we are serving are not impacted by lead poisoning, which has devastating consequences. So you also want to make sure that everyone on your team who is doing HQS inspections has taken the lead paint visual assessment training. It's a web-based training. It's linked here. And that you've got in your files the certificates for having completed that training. So again, when your COC comes out to monitor or HUD comes out to monitor, they can ask to see those certificates for anyone that did lead paint visual assessment. And then you want to also make sure that everyone you are serving, so not just folks who are pregnant or families that have young children, but every household that you're serving gets the lead hazard information pamphlet that is linked here. There's also a form linked here that you can use to document that, in fact, folks received that lead hazard information pamphlet. All right. So before I move on to a poll, I just want to pause for a minute. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Does anyone have questions on content that we have talked about? All right, don't be shy at any time. Please speak up. All right, Rosa, do you want to launch the poll? All right, get the slides aligned here. So first question. These are all true or false. I only need to notify participants of their grievance rights when they have a complaint. Second, even if I have a signed release, the participant can change their mind at any time. Third, I only need to provide VAWA notices to the head of household. And fourth, all units require a lead-based paint visual inspection. So I'll give you a few minutes to fill out the form. Maybe Howard will sing to us while we're waiting. I don't know if Howard's in a singing mood today. He does an excellent rendition of the Jeopardy song.
Of the Jeopardy song. I found out that Merv Griffin wrote that song. Did you know that?
I did not. I didn't know that Merv Griffin wrote music.
Yeah, no, he's a very talented man, it turns out.
Learn something new every day.
Am I able to ask a quick question in this pause period?
You sure are. You sure are.
So I think maybe I just missed hearing you say it, but for somebody who does like the HQS inspections, did you say that they are also required to do the lead paint visual assessment as long as, it's built before 1978? Like, did you say that that's a requirement as well?
Yeah, so if you're inspecting a unit that was built after 1978 and is going to house either a child under the age of 6 or someone who is pregnant, then you've got to do that lead paint visual inspection as part of the HQS.
Okay, thank you.
That's where you document that you've done the visual inspection. It can be confusing because some of the forms that are kicking around, those HQS forms, it'll say not applicable. And in some cases, it is applicable, right? Okay, so if it's applicable, ignore it if it says not applicable.
Got it. All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. All right. You think we're ready to share the results here? All right. So on the first one, I only need to notify participants of their grievance rights when they have a complaint. Everybody got that correct. The answer to that is false. You should notify participants at everyone at project entry about their grievance rights. So if somebody signed a release, can they change their mind at any time? Yes, that is true. Someone can rescind an authorization to release information at any time, and you all got that correct as well. Let me just put up, I just realized I don't have the answers. Do that next. And then I only need to provide the VAWA notices to the head of household. So that's actually incorrect. So you've got to provide the notice of occupancy rights and the incident certification form to all adults in the household, not just the head of household. And the idea to that is that the person who is the victim of domestic violence may not be the head of household and may not otherwise learn about those rights. And then lastly, all units require a lead-based paint visual inspection. So that is false. So only units that were where the building was constructed after 1978 and there's either someone who's pregnant or a child under the age of 6 require that visual inspection. All right. So we have in the slides here the answers. So in case they're useful to you to refer back to later, I am going to move on and talk about fair market rent. So I'm sure folks are familiar with this, right? Fair market rents are the rent levels that HUD sets every year. They are supposed to be sufficient to rent a decent, not a luxury unit in your local community, although I think people often find that they are not sufficient to rent a decent unit, and they are based on the number of bedrooms that a unit has. So when you do a project application every year for HUD, the maximum amount of money that you can apply for in either your rental assistance or your leasing units budget is going to be based on FMR. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the maximum that you can expend on a unit, right? So it's how you're budgeted, but not necessarily the maximum that you can pay for rent. So in a leasing project, so meaning if your project has a leasing budget line item, in fact, that FMR is the cap that you can pay, right? You can't rent over that amount. If you've got a rental assistance project, rent reasonableness is the cap that you can pay, and we'll talk about that more in detail in a minute. So it's important to understand that the FMRs include the utility allowance. So if you are a leasing project, you can only rent units where the gross rent, right, so the amount due to the landlord each month plus the utility allowance is under both FMR and rent reasonableness. All right, now we're going to talk about rent reasonableness. So HUD also requires that for rental assistance and for leasing projects that you document rent reasonableness. So basically what that means is that you look at 3 comparable units, so units that are about the same size as the unit that you want to rent, units that are located in the same neighborhood as the unit that you want to rent, and units that have similar amenities to the unit that you want to rent. And that you've got to have a policy, right, for your program that says how you're going to determine rent reasonableness. And then you have to follow that policy and determine rent reasonableness in accordance with your policy. And so you've got to document that the unit that you rented, for example, is equal, that the rent on it is equal or less than the rent of the 3 comparable units. And you've got to make sure that the methodology that you used is documented in that policy, and that the actual rent reasonableness determination is in your participant files. So again, if you are a leasing project, the gross rent, so the rent plus the utility allowance, has to be at or below both FMR and rent reasonableness. But if you are a rental assistance project, you can rent over FMR as long as you have the money in your budget and as long as you have documented that that rent is reasonable. So this form is an example of how you can document rent reasonableness. So you don't necessarily have to use this specific form, but it's one option that you can use, and it's linked here, this slide, and you can see that it's got 4 columns, right? It's got where you record the information on the unit that you want to assist, and then on the 3 comparable units, and down towards the bottom, it has a place where you would record how much the rent is, how much the utility allowance is, and then the gross rents, which is the rent adjusted for any applicable utility allowance. And you do that both for the proposed unit and for the comparable units. All right. So, going to talk about conflicts of interest. So a conflict of interest is basically a situation in which someone has competing interests, right? And those interests are in conflict with one another. So for example, if I work at a COC project, right, I am responsible for spending grant funds prudently, right, and not paying more than necessary for rent, for example. I may also in my private life happen to be a landlord, and I own some properties. And as a landlord, it's in my financial interest to charge as much rent as I can for those units. So HUD prohibits you from renting units that someone on your staff or your board or an immediate family member of theirs owns, because that's a conflict of interest. So the prohibition against conflict of interest is really intended to help ensure that our projects are putting our duties to people experiencing homelessness first, and that we are not acting in ways that put our personal financial interests first. So another example of this is if your agency owns a unit, you are not able to your staff cannot do HQS inspections or rent reasonableness determinations on those units. You have to contract with another entity to do those things because HUD considers that to be a conflict of interest. All right, I see. Okay, so
the question was answered. So, yeah.
Oh, okay, great. All right. So environmental review. So HUD requires that all COC projects complete environmental review forms, and this has not been particularly well advertised either to COCs or to field offices nationally, but HUD did do a nationwide environmental review, and that eliminates the need for many projects to fill out these environmental review forms because HUD did one nationally. And through federal fiscal year 2027, that nationwide environmental review covers tenant-based rental assistance and tenant-based leasing projects, supportive services only projects, HMIS projects, and COC planning projects. So if you are, which most of you are going to be, either a tenant-based rental assistance project, so almost all rapid rehousing projects are going to be tenant-based rental assistance projects, or tenant-based leasing projects, meaning that the participant gets to go out and choose any unit that meets the qualifications, right, HQS, et cetera, and rent them rather than being limited to units that your agency has chosen. So any project that is tenant-based rental assistance or tenant-based leasing is going to be covered under the nationwide environmental review. So that leaves, for the purposes of our target audience today, if you are a YHDP project and you have opted to use the special activity that allows you to use the leasing budget line item rather than tenant-based rental assistance in a rapid rehousing program, and you have master leased units, and so participants can only live in one of those units that you have master leased, or you are the TH side of the rapid rehousing TH project, and you've got that TH located at a specific site, right? Again, that means that the tenants don't get to pick their own unit, and you are going to have to do your own environmental review. And the purpose of environmental review really is to demonstrate compliance with various environmental requirements. So things like whether or not you've got the appropriate flood insurance in place, And this is a recapture risk, right? So if HUD comes out and you're required to do environmental review and you haven't done it, technically you are not allowed to expend funds until you've done it, and it's a potential that they could recapture, although probably not, hopefully not. So if you are not covered by the nationwide review, then you've got to do an environmental review at least every 5 years or when environmental conditions change. And so a good way to know whether or not you are due for environmental review is to check the last environmental review that you did, see when it was signed by your responsible entity. And if it has been more than 5 years, then you definitely need to do a new environmental review. All right. So I think we covered most of the content on this slide already. This slide links to the correct environmental review form for projects that are not where participants are not choosing their own unit. And it also links to a sample of a completed CEST environmental review form. So should you be in a situation where you have to do one of these, you can refer to that sample form. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about responsible entities because we often see this in monitoring. So sometimes we see agencies having their own staff sign off as the responsible entity, and that is not correct, right? So the responsible entity is always going to be a government official. It cannot be a staff person at a nonprofit agency. So it's the responsible entity as defined by HUD is the local government agency where the project is located that exercises land use responsibility. So in a bigger city, it might be something like a Department of Housing. In a smaller town, it's sometimes called community, like the Department of Community Development. Sometimes it's hard to determine who the responsible entity is, and you cannot find anyone in local government who is willing to sign off on your environmental review. And should that happen to you, you should document who you reached out to, what their response was, and then notify your field office that no one in local government is willing to sign and ask if someone at HUD would sign. And document that you have done that as well. So you just want to document that you've done your due diligence. Oftentimes in small towns, we see the mayor's office signing off. But again, it can't be someone on your team signing off. And if you can't get anyone to sign off, including HUD, then again, just document your due diligence to notify HUD that that's the case. Questions about that? All right, so we are going to do another quick Zoom poll. Can you launch the poll? There we go. All right, so first question. You don't need to worry about rent reasonableness if the rent is below FMR. And to be considered comparable, a unit must be located in a place that is comparable to the assisted unit, of comparable size and of comparable quality with comparable amenities. A project needs a new environmental review every 3 years, and dogs are perfect. And again, these are true-false questions. See, we have a fellow dog fan in our crowd, Victoria. All right, we'll give people 10 more seconds to answer the polls, and then we will share the results. All right, Rosie, you want to go ahead and share the results? All right, so the first question, you don't need to worry about rent reasonableness if the rent is below FMR. That is false. Right? So you have to do rent reasonableness determinations regardless of whether or not a unit is below FMR. That's what establishes the cap for rental assistance projects, and for leasing projects, the cap is the lower of rent reasonableness or FMR. So for both types of projects, you have to do rent reasonableness determinations on every single unit, regardless of whether or not the rent is below FMR. All right, next, to be considered a comparable unit, right? Yes, this is true. It's got to be comparable on each of these factors: location, size, quality, and amenities. True. Everybody got that right. a project needs a new environmental review every 3 years. That's false. The standard is every 5 years. And again, this is only going to be relevant if your participants are not choosing the unit in which they live. But if you've got to do an environmental review, you're going to have to do it at least every 5 years or when the environmental conditions change. And the last one, of course, is true. Dogs are perfect. And if anyone wants to debate that, Howard and I would be happy to have that debate after this session is over. But we also love cats, for anybody that's a cat lover. Okay, so next topic. So now I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about leases and occupancy agreement requirements, and then I am going to hand it over to Howard. So, apologies for the jerkiness in the slide advancing here. So, okay, so leases and occupancy agreements. So all of your projects have got to have signed leases, whether you're a rapid rehousing or a joint project. You've got to have a signed lease for all of your rapid rehousing units, and for your TH units, you've got to have a signed occupancy agreement with each of the participants in your program. And each of those agreements has got to have a VAWA addendum to the lease or occupancy agreement. And there's a sample VAWA addendum linked here. So if you are a rental assistance project, then the initial term on that lease has to be for at least 1 year. And it's got to be automatically renewable unless, I think, if I remember correctly, there's also a YHDP special activity for this. So it's possible if you're a YHDP program that you can lease a unit for a shorter term by that if you've been approved for one of those special activities. And then for the TH, the transitional housing side of our joint projects, the term of that occupancy agreement has to be a minimum of 1 month, and it has to be renewable for up to 24 months. So for all of your participant files, you want to make sure that you've got copies of those leases and occupancy agreements. And again, if you are paying rent on a unit and you do not have the lease in your file, HUD could recapture those funds. So you really want to make sure that you've got that information in the client files. So there is a difference between how the leasing arrangements look depending upon whether you are a rental assistance project or you are assisting units through the COC budget, leasing budget line item. So this first example is what the leasing arrangement should look like in most of your rapid rehousing projects, unless you've got that special activity for YHDP that allows you to use the leasing budget line item instead of the rental assistance budget line item. But in the vast majority of rapid rehousing projects, the lease is going to be directly between the participant and the landlord, and the participant signs a lease directly with the landlord, and you are going to want to have a contract, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Those are usually called housing assistance payment or HAP contracts with the landlord. But the lease, you are not going to be a party to the lease. The landlord leases directly to the program participant. This is different in a leasing project. So in a leasing project, you are going to have the recipient or subrecipient is going to sign a lease with the owner of the building, right? And then you're going to sublease or have an occupancy agreement with the program participant, right? So it is not allowable in the leasing program for the participant to lease directly from the landlord. It really does need to be, in order to apply with HUD's requirements, a master leasing situation. All right. So, and then finally, housing assistant payment agreements. So I said back when we were talking about the leasing arrangements for rental assistance projects, that the lease is going to be between the owner and the participant, but you are going to want to have a contract in place that sets out the terms for the subsidy that you're paying, right? So whenever you are executing a lease for a rental assistance program, you also want to be executing a housing assistance payment agreement. The term should be identical to the terms on the lease, right? So if the lease is January 1 to December 31st, the HAP payment contract should have that same term. And in that HAP contract, you want to establish things like how much the subsidy is going to pay versus how much the tenant's going to pay. The fact that that is subject to change based upon recertification and redetermination of tenant income. Prohibiting side deals, right? So it is not allowable for a landlord to say to somebody, hey, we know that the subsidy is only going to pay up to $1,000 a month, but this unit actually costs $1,200 a month. And so you have to pay us that $200 a month on the side in addition. That is not allowable. And you want to be sure it's clear in the HAP contract that that is prohibited. You also want to make sure that the contract establishes the conditions under which the subsidy can be terminated. So for example, if somebody gets evicted, you're not going to continue to pay on the unit. HUD says that for a rental assistance project, you can pay no more than 30 days from the end of the month in which the person was evicted. Also, you're going to want to say in there that if the person goes to jail for more than 90 days or otherwise gets institutionalized for more than 90 days, that you are not going to continue to pay the subsidy on that unit. You also want to make sure in there is your right to inspect that unit with reasonable notice, and that if you find that the unit does not pass inspection, that you can withhold the subsidy payment until such time as the landlord corrects those issues. And then lastly, you want to make sure that that HAP contract also lays out the procedures for, what is an allowable charge against the security deposit and to whom and when the landlord is responsible for returning that security deposit. So I'm going to turn it over to Howard if there are no additional questions.
It doesn't look like there are, so I think I'll take it over now. Hi, everybody. Great to be with you this morning. Let's see what we're talking about now. So right now, we're going to talk a little bit about income verification and how you determine the amount of subsidy to pay to participants. This, especially the subsidy calculation, is a little more complicated under rapid rehousing than it is under permanent supportive housing, because under the COC rules, the amount of subsidy is ideally intended to diminish over time in rapid rehousing to try and transition people to sort of full self-sufficiency in their housing. So let's move on here. So first off, you need to examine the income of all members of the household at least every year. That means, again, all members, that's children. If you've got sort of a, should I call it a non-traditional family arrangement where you've got, multiple adults living in the household, any adult or any even youngster coming into the household, you've got to determine whether or not they have income, and you've got to get documentation as to what that income is. It is a requirement of participants in the program that they report changes of their income to you. If there is a fairly significant enough change in their income to change it by $50 or more a month, then you are expected to adjust the subsidy to reflect that change. It is a requirement that the participants in a COC funded program, even in a Housing First program, provide you information about their income. It's critical that they provide that information so that you are able to correctly calculate the subsidy. If you don't have that information, you could over-subsidize people. And if you over-subsidize people, it is entirely possible that on monitoring, HUD will come in and require you to pay that money back to the government if you have over-subsidized. So you want to be careful not to do that. Well, that is a good question. What is income for folks? So first of all, obviously, employment is income to folks, and that includes all these things that are listed here: wages, salary, overtime, tips, commissions, bonuses. Again, if it's tips and things like that, we're going to rely on people to self-report that income. If they're receiving any kind of regular benefit income, these listed here: Social Security, pensions, disability, that is income, as well as other programs such as unemployment and workman compensation. Transitional assistance to families in need or other kinds of income support is considered to be income. Remember, Things like SNAP benefits, food stamps are not considered income. They are in-kind benefits. It's not a cash income, so that's not something that you do calculate. If it is assumed, by the way, if there is a court-ordered child support in place, it is generally assumed that the participant is receiving that court-ordered child support. Now, oftentimes that is actually not the case, even though it's court-ordered. Sometimes the spouse that's required to pay it does not make those payments. But what you need to do in those cases, if you know that there is a court-ordered child support payment, then what you need to do is obtain documentation that the household is actually not getting that child support on a regular basis, and then you don't have to pay attention to that. You also, the concept of regular gifts, if, for example, you've got a household with young children and you've got grandparents, and the grandparents have got some resources, and on a regular basis, they're providing some income so as to make sure that the family can afford to feed the kids, clothe the kids, do other things for them. Under those cases, if it's regular support coming from somebody outside of the household, you actually have to consider that to be income as well. There is a net, if you have a situation where the participant has their own business, it could be, I think that would also cover things like Uber or DoorDash and things like that. If people are earning income that way, then you want to calculate that income. And again, if that is the case, I mean, if they're doing a DoorDash and they've got insurance on their car, they're paying gas, they've got other payments on their car and stuff like that, they can deduct some of those expenses as expenses of doing their business, and you really want to only calculate the net income, that which remains coming to the family. If you have a situation where your household member is the one who is required to pay child support to their children in another, who are not living with them, unfortunately, that is not a deduction, and that really is a challenge for some folks, but that is not considered an income deduction. So you basically, even if they have required child support and they are good people and they're making those payments, you can't give them any credit for making those child support payments. You just can't, you can't pay attention to that at all. And basically, if you've got any kind of co-payments or stuff like that that need to be made by people for health insurance purposes or anything like that, those additional payments are all considered part of the medical deduction, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, let's go on. Now, in the event that you have someone who is at zero income, and that is, not uncommon in the Continuum of Care program, it is expected that you're going to get an affidavit from them that say they have zero income, and at each certification and recertification, you are expected to get a certification or verification that they have zero income. Again, it's just another sort of formality to make sure that people understand that they're expected to report their income, and they can't just say, if they're going to say they have no income, they're going to have to certify that to you. And so we've got a sample here attached of that zero income certification. Again, as we said already, you need to provide income documentation that's required, again, of all household members. There are times where people have some difficulty in order to be able to provide you that information. It could be there are certain instances where people may have some mental health issues that just makes it difficult for them to be able to either comply with that or focus in on these issues. Then you're expected, under those circumstances, to make some reasonable accommodations to provide some additional support to folks as they are doing it, to make sure that they can be able to fulfill the requirement. If you see that there is a clear disability, you want to make some accommodations to assist them in meeting these requirements. Needless to say, if you're doing a rent calculation based on the income of a participant, then you need to make sure that the calculation that you're doing is based on the actual income with the deductions that are allowable to it, and that you can show that the income that you've documented is consistent with the amount that you're using to determine the subsidy they're receiving. And obviously, this is something, should HUD have any resources to come and monitor, this is something that you want to have documentation in your files to show that this is how you collected the income documentation. Remember, when you're doing any documentation from HUD, the first thing that you always want to get is some appropriate third-party documentation. Could be written third-party documentation, could be pay stub, any, income tax returns, anything like that. That is sort of a written documentation. You want that first. The second layer of things is a sort of a self-reported, a self-certified thing. And then finally, if you can't get those things, then you basically to demonstrate they're making best efforts to obtain that information. But remember, income information is required. So if folks really are not complying and providing you with that income information, then you really will have, it's not entirely appropriate for you to be able to serve them. They've got to provide that information to you. So now we talked about what we were talking about before was how you calculate sort of the gross income coming to participants, but there's always been some deductions that you're allowed to I'm sorry, there are things that you do not calculate as income. Deductions are a separate category. So one things that you don't count, we said you need to calculate the income of all participants, but if you have in the household minors, children who are under the age of 18, and they have got a after school job or something like that, God bless them for that. They keep all that money themselves. You pay no attention to employment income for children under the age of 18. However, there are instances, especially Social Security, where some minors are recipients of that income. If it is benefit income going into the household, even to a minor, you count that as income. This other category, temporary, non-recurring, or sporadic income and gifts, is a challenging thing. But basically, again, if you've got somebody, I don't know whether anybody hangs out in front of Home Depots anymore for fear of ICE, but back in the day, people would do temporary day labor by appearing at a Home Depot or someplace like that. Under those circumstances, again, if it is, once a month, every 4 months or something like that, that is clearly temporary or sporadic. If they are presenting for day labor on a regular basis, that is how they support themselves, then you are going to consider that to be regular income and you're going to count that. As indicated, one example that is often given for other kinds of examples of temporary labor is, as you know, we conduct the census and we used to reapportion on a 10-year basis. But if it is census time, if that is always by definition temporary work, because it only lasts for a few months, and the federal government has been very clear that census work is something you consider temporary work. So anything that's similar to that, where the employment is only going to be for a very time-limited period of time, that's considered temporary, and you don't consider that as income. If you've got a household that is that is supporting foster children, the benefits that they get, the payments they get for taking care of those foster children are not considered to be income. By the way, you do have to consider those foster kids part of the household, so you sort of have to accommodate them in a unit that is large enough in order to accommodate both those foster kids and any other member of the household. Lump sums is an interesting thing. Basically, if folks were to get an inheritance, if they were to, God forbid, be in some kind of an accident and they're injured and they get some sort of an insurance settlement, anything like that. The other example here that we give is, happy days. They play the lottery and they win, which we all know ends up making people more unhappy than happy. But in the event that they do that, then you want to, you don't pay attention to that. That is considered to be a lump sum addition. If they are getting any reimbursement, they paid out of pocket for medical expenses and they are reimbursed by insurance or anything like that, you don't consider that to be income. As you know, in many instances, people with disabilities are entitled to the services of a live-in aid if it is essential for them to be able to live independently in the community. A live-in aid, although a live-in aid is a resident in the household, they are not considered to be a member of the household. They are in the household solely to perform a service for a member of the household, so you pay no attention to the income of somebody who is a legitimate live-in aid. They have to be so classified. Remember, if somebody classifies themselves as a live-in aid, they have no rights of succession. As soon as the person that they are assisting is no longer living in the unit, that live-in aid also loses any support for living in that unit. If you've got a student, full-time student in the household and they're receiving financial assistance because of their student status, you do not consider that income as well. And then finally, there's this little note at the bottom here. If you've got someone who is a full-time student, by the way, a full-time student is determined by the educational institution that they are a student in. So they are going to say what kind of a course load is necessary in order to be a full-time student. If that is the case and they qualify as a full-time student, then you do not pay attention to their income other than the first $480 of their income. That is the deduction that is allowable for a dependent. That's why you take that first $480, and then basically all income above that $480 is not counted as household income. So here are some deductions that, by the way, all of these, I've been doing this a long time. These are the same numbers. These deductions are the same exact numbers that have been in place for decades. And not that the cost of living has changed over the past 2 to 3 decades, but it may have. We
Nope.
still have,
Not
we
at all.
still, we still have these deductions. So, by the way, there was a legislation passed called HOTMA. It basically changed these things. It increased them. Not only did it increase these deductions, but it also set up in motion basically a way to continue to increase them as the cost of living increases. However, as in the Inspire inspection standards, HUD hasn't quite gotten around to implementing these changes for the Continuum of Care program. Someday they hopefully will do it. So until they do, these are the income deductions that you can take off of folks' gross income. So all households that are either headed by an elderly, that's considered somebody who's 62 years of age or older, or a person with disabilities, every one of and by the way, that would have to be, we're talking about rapid rehousing, but that would have to be everybody in permanent supportive housing, because you've got to have disability to get permanent supportive housing. So anytime you've got an elderly or disabled household, they automatically get this one deduction of $400 a year. Whoopee. If you have dependents in the household, as we talked, that's minor children, could also be considered to be a child who is a full-time student in an educational institution, then they are eligible for this $480 dependent deduction. Remember, if there are 10 kids, you get 10 times the $480. Again, for elderly disabled households, if there are medical expenses that they have that are not reimbursed by insurance or some other source, to the extent that those expenses exceed 3% of the household's gross income, they can be classified as a deduction, and therefore they can be deducted from income. There's a lot of stuff in terms of medical expenses and things like that. I mean, for example, if they're going and purchasing or regularly need to purchase over-the-counter medications and no one is reimbursing them for those over-the-counter medications, if they need eyeglasses and no one is reimbursing them for the cost of those eyeglasses, all things like that can be considered to be a medical expense, and if they can be itemized and documented, they can be a deduction. The reasonable costs of child care, now that's only this caveat to remote work or education is really important. You don't pay for childcare so folks can go out and play mahjong. You do pay for childcare so folks have to go to work and need somebody to look over the household. Again, for the most part, we're talking about if it's a non-disabled child, it's up to the age of 13. If it's a disabled child, it's up to the age of 18. And basically, again, reasonable. What's important there is if the cost of childcare, if you're doing the childcare in order to be able to go out and work, if the cost of childcare exceeds the income that is earned by the person who's benefiting from that childcare, you can't do that. You cannot the cost of the child. You can't get a deduction for the cost of childcare if it exceeds the income that is earned by the person who is being assisted. Okay, all right. Then there is also assets. Folks are allowed to have now. By the way, asset means, for the most part in this program, what we're talking about is if they have any kind of bank account, savings accounts, something like that, where that fund would be. We don't consider household furnishings. We don't consider a vehicle that's necessary in order to go to work or in order to live in the thing. We don't consider them to be assets. The only things that would be considered to be assets are something additional that could be held in reserve for them. They can have up to $5,000 in assets, and basically you pay no attention to that. If their assets exceed $5,000, then what you do is you must compute an income of those assets. HUD basically has said that the way you impute income from assets is based on the passbook savings rate, which the one they still use is 0.6%, which as shown in this example, that means 0.6 means 0.006 times the number, it's 0.6%. And so therefore, as an example, if somebody had $50,000 in savings, which is not common, but say they had that, even in that instance, the only assets that we'd be talking about, or the income that we'd be looking at is $300 a year. So that's not going to be a significant factor for folks. Again, so who do we use, gross or net income? Gross income, again, is the total income prior to any of those deductions we talked about. That's the disabled, the dependents, the medical expense deductions. The net income is basically the income that remains in the household after you grant them all those deductions. If you've got business income, DoorDash, as I said, you want to just count that income after they have deducted out their gasoline, vehicle maintenance expenses like that. And if you are basically their income is from employment, you want to calculate their income based on not the deductions in their paycheck, but in the gross income as shown in the paycheck, even though obviously their taxes and other sums deducted from the paycheck. Okay, we have got a Zoom poll here now. So Rosa, if you could start this up, and while we're doing that, again, the questions are: providing documentation of income is optional for participants in a Housing First project, true or false? Next question is, Joe is 22 years old and babysits for his niece 1 day per week and gets paid cash. The income is countable when calculating rent, true or false? Ron and Jeremy are both disabled and consider each other family. They live together in rapid rehousing and each receive the disability deduction, $800 total when calculating the rent, true or false? Take your time, and when you get a chance, let us know. Give you another couple of minutes. Okay, we get a number of responses here. Okay, let's keep going. Rosa, why don't you close that down and let's take a look at what we got as our responses. So the first one, documentation of income is optional. Everybody got that right. It's not optional. Everybody has got to provide documentation of income. Everyone got this one right too. This income is countable when calculating rent because it's regular. We know that he's getting that. And Ron and Jeremy are both disabled and consider each other family, and they are each receiving the disability deduction. Unfortunately, this one is false because, as we said earlier, there's only one disability deduction per household. So you do not consider both of them to be receiving that deduction. And there we go. And there are your answers for your thing in the future. Okay, now this thing about utility allowances and reimbursements may actually be some news to some folks. So Lauren made reference to this before. Basically, again, the fair market rents, the rent you charge, are considered to be inclusive of the utility allowance of the utilities at the local PHA's utility allowance level. Now, when there is a requirement that participants are paying the utilities, basically, and they're also required to make a rent payment, their rent payment first goes to pay the utilities. If the utilities is equal to their rent payment that's required, that's what they pay. They pay their utilities. They do not, again, remember, it's the utilities at the utility allowance level, not the actual cost of utilities to the household. But if that equals the utility allowance equals what their rental contribution is supposed to be, then basically they make that utility allowance payment and you subsidize the balance of the rent. If the payment that they are required to make is less than the utility allowance, then basically that is an amount of money that the participant is owed because they are entitled to a subsidy at the utility allowance level. And if you have a situation like that, you are expected to basically cover the cost of those utilities that exceed their minimum rental contribution, and therefore you're expected to reimburse folks. Generally speaking, the ideal way to do that is to make the payments directly to the utility. This way, you know that the funds are going towards utilities. Remember, people with extremely low incomes have got a lot of income crises on a regular basis. On any given day, there may be a need to pay something even more than the utility bill. Therefore, to sort of protect folks, it's advisable to make the payments directly to the utility. But in order to do that, you need to get releases from your participant to show that you are able to communicate with, we will show that I lost it because I see this comment that Lauren just made in the chat here. I just want to calculate that they actually have changed the passbook savings rate. So it's not the 0.6% that I talked about. For our current, or right now, it's 0.45%. So it's even lower than that. So all the more reason why there's not going to happen. But a lot of times people are not. This thing about utility reimbursement, really make sure you pay attention to that. That's something that folks are not always focusing in on. Okay, now, unlike permanent supportive housing, which follows really strict standard rules that are given by HUD, in rapid rehousing, the amount of subsidy and for how long people receive subsidies and how much rent they're required to pay is based on the written standards that each continuum of care has. COCs, as the thing said, based on that written policy, have a lot of discretion on what it is they are allowed to require folks to pay. And I believe our next slide is going to tell us, here we are, what the rent payment standards are in the Rhode Island Continuum of Care. And again, there's no such thing as a minimum rent. Sometimes you see that in the Section 8 program, but there is no minimum rent in this program. So if tenants have zero income, then they do not have to pay rent. However, the COC, and this is a COC policy, requires that participants pay a minimum of 30% of their adjusted monthly income for their rent. That's why even in rapid rehousing, you've got to have the income of all housing participants, because that's the only way you can calculate that they're not paying more than 30% of it. And here is the basically months 1 to 6. Assistance can be provided up to 100% of the rent amount. Again, that's in the case of a zero income participant. Months 7 to 9, as you see, it's diminishing. And in the second year, rental assistance is limited to 40% of the actual rent amount that the participants are paying. So, however, again, since this is an assistance program that is the goal, the ultimate goal is to both to ensure that people are not homeless and prevent people from becoming homeless. So therefore, if enacting these limits on assistance could lead to the household becoming homeless, you're expected to try and make your best efforts to not force people to homelessness. So for up to 20% of the households that you are serving in a rapid rehousing program, you can extend the limits, basically increase the amount of assistance that you provided. You don't have to do that diminishing scale. Again, if they had to pay more rent, they would not be able to maintain their housing, then you're not going to do it. If you can automatically go up to 20%. If you're going over 20% of your participants, you need to provide documentation in your files for each one of those cases as to why it is necessary to provide that assistance to prevent them from becoming homelessness. But remember, when you sign a contract with HUD for rapid rehousing, it's going to specify the number of people that you are going to serve in that agreement, and HUD expects that you will serve the number of people in that agreement. Usually, this is not an issue for rapid rehousing because basically there's generally turnover in those units. So generally speaking, rapid rehousing programs are generally able to serve at least the number of people in their HUD agreement, and oftentimes many more people than that. Again, only because there's turnover in the program. And again, there is this 24-month time limitation on the rapid rehousing assistance. It's important to explain how all of this works to participants, because this is not sort of how it works under Section 8, which is what many people may be familiar with. So you want to help them understand as to how their rent calculations are done and why they change over time. You want to make sure the landlords are aware of what it is that you're going to be paying. So when they receive a slightly lower subsidy amount from you, they know why that's going on. Also, again, as we said before, they are required to provide information on income changes. Generally speaking, people are pretty quick on telling you when their income has reduced. Sometimes they're a little slower to tell you that their income has increased, but they're required to do that. One of the things in written standards is saying how many times people can come back and receive rapid rehousing assistance. That means after the completion of that assistance, the 24 months of assistance, if they continue to need assistance, they can come seek additional support through coordinated entry, and there is no limitation on the number of times they do that, nor is there a limit on the total amount of financial assistance that can be provided through rapid rehousing for a household. Now, you are allowed to pay security deposits out of rental assistance or leasing funds. Rhode Island has limits on the amount of security deposit. It limits to 1 month's rent. HUD actually would allow you to pay a higher security deposit, but you can't do it in contravention of Rhode Island state law. So that is the limitation on the amount of security deposit that you can pay using COC funds or any funds in the state of Rhode Island. And also sometimes, to help and incentivize landlords to participate in the program, you are allowed to, when you sign a lease, provide the first month's rent. Obviously, landlords usually expect that, but you're also allowed to pay the last month's rent as well. So basically, you can provide them with a security deposit, the first month's rent, and the last month's rent. So you can provide up to 3 months' rent in your initial payment to the landlords. And sometimes 3 months' rent is a good incentive to get landlords to participate. Now, on a regular basis, on an annual basis, you need to do these kinds of recertifications. That means you've got to re-inspect the units annually to make sure they still meet standards. You need to redo your rent reasonableness determination because the housing market changes. Lauren spoke about environmental review. I mean, basically, again, if it is sponsor-based, project-based, something like that, you're going to need, and you have added, especially if it's and you've added some units to the lists that are assisted in the project, you need to adjust your environmental review to cover those additional units. You need to redo your income documentation and your subsidy calculation on an annual basis. You want to make sure that if the lease expires, that you've got in file an annual lease that shows the correct period for that you're covering, and also that you've updated your housing assistance payment agreement with the landlord on that. There are certain data such as income information like that needs to be entered into HMIS on an annual basis, and so you want to make sure that you're updating the income as reported in HMIS. And if you're automatically making payments to landlords, to utilities, or anything like that, you want to regularly check on that to make sure that it's still the correct payee, that the source is correct there, and you are making those payments accurately. Now, again, in an eviction, we are talking this is a lease-based program, so the only time that a landlord is allowed to evict a tenant in a lease-based situation is through a court action. Often, obviously, our goal is to do whatever we can to prevent our participants from being evicted from a unit. As everybody knows, anyone who has an eviction on their housing history is going to have much greater difficulty securing a new unit, and oftentimes the unit may not be of very, very high quality because those folks are considered to be a high-risk tenant. So you want to do everything you can to prevent folks from being evicted. That means even if you've got a situation where the relationship with the landlord is so soured that they really don't want your participant to be there anymore, you still want to make your best efforts to be able to try and negotiate a departure from the unit that does not require an eviction. So that's what we're talking about, negotiations here. We really want to do what we can to prevent it from happening. Now, as these things say, however, if someone does end up being evicted from their unit, that is not the same thing as being terminated from the program. You are allowed to maintain that enrollment of that person and assist them in securing other housing, and you're expected to do that. If for a variety of reasons that not possible, then that participant can come back and request assistance again in the program. Again, as we said, under the written standard, you're allowed to get rapid rehousing assistance on multiple occasions. But remember, it's going to require an entry through coordinated entry, and that participant may not be the highest priority for the available assistance if they have been evicted. I see there's a question here. If a client has an initial 12-month lease and we have a HAP contract with the landlord, do we need to have another HAP contract and lease signed if the participant is just going month to month afterwards? I think you do want to update those agreements and show that does happen. Oftentimes the lease will convert to a month to month, but I think you want to enter into certainly a new HAP agreement with the landlord, reflecting the fact that the agreement is still in place. So again, prior to discontinuing financial assistance under rapid rehousing, you want to make sure that people understand that how the rapid rehousing works, what they're supposed to be doing, their requirements to participate in case management, due in the housing assistance plan. So this is in cases where the household no longer requires that financial assistance in there. You just want to have a good discussion with them so that they understand what their responsibilities are in the absence of that financial assistance to the program. After you've had that discussion with them explaining what it is their obligations are going to be, you want to document that in writing so that they are familiar with what it is that they need to do in order to maintain their housing. And now, we have another Zoom poll. Rosa, if we could launch that. So the questions are, what determines the utility allowance? The current month's amount shown, the amount shown on PHA utility allowance schedule, or the amount of arrears on the participant's utility bill? Must a rapid rehousing participant who is evicted from their unit be terminated from the program? That is the question, yes or no. A few more minutes for the responses. I'm sorry, I'm not doing my little musical interlude, but since time is advancing, why don't we wrap up the poll? and see what we got. Oh, good. One more response came in. Great. So on this question, of course, the utility allowance amount is based on the PHA's utility allowance, not the actual cost of utilities. And in fact, the PHAs are required to set their utility allowance at a level that is consistent with what an energy conserving household would do. Generally speaking, most of our households would not be classified as energy conserving households. So oftentimes the utility allowance is not going to be the same as what their utility costs are. Must a rapid rehousing participant evicted from the unit be terminated from the program? No, they don't have to be terminated from the program. And indeed, you're expected to try and continue to provide them with assistance to stop them from returning to homelessness. Okay, and now here's the answers from the next slide for your future reference. Now, project exit requirements. What happens when people are ready to leave the program? So first off, in all instances, when folks are leaving, you're no longer to provide them assistance. You're supposed to be providing them with written notification. There should be a reason for that termination. Indeed, and the way you do this is you need to provide them a written copy of the program rules and requirements when they first enter the program, so then they understand what those requirements are, and then you reference that when you're terminating assistance, saying we provided you with these rules. This is the thing that you did not follow. This is why we're terminating that assistance. In all instances, HUD would require that you provide folks an opportunity to appeal the decision in case there was, something, some facts that you had were wrong or something like that. You want to make sure they've got a choice to do it. Remember, if they're appealing, they've got to be able to make that appeal to someone who is not the person who made the initial denial, and indeed it's got to be somebody who is in the organization in a superior position to the person who made that initial determination, so that they basically have the authority to overrule what that initial decision would be. If the executive director has made the decision to terminate a participant, the case manager is not going to have the authority to overrule what the executive director has said. So you want to make sure that whoever is hearing that appeal has the authority to change the decision if that is appropriate. Then after they've gotten a chance to do the appeal, you've got to inform them in writing as to what the outcome is of that appeal. Again, as Lauren had said at the outset, these are one of those instances where you need to provide them with the VAWA, both notification of occupancy rights and the incident self-certification form. And if you are not, if they're not in contact with you, and you basically provide that written response to the last address that you have on record for the client so that you can get to them. And if you're terminating assistance, you've gone through the appeal process, make sure that you're not still continuing to provide subsidy to the participants as you would expect. In the event that folks are no longer, or that your prime participant is no longer in the unit, you can provide rental assistance only for up to 30 days after the end of the month in which the unit was vacated. If the participant is staying in an institution for 90 days or less, you can continue to do those rent subsidies. But if they've died or been institutionalized for more than 90 days, if there are other members of the household, you can continue to provide assistance until the end of the lease term. If that person was living alone, there's no one else in the household, and again, they're going to be absent for greater than 90 days, then basically you need to terminate all assistance to the unit. So if they're surviving family members, you can continue to support until the end of the lease term. If it's just an individual participant, then basically the assistance stops upon their departure. You can use rental assistance funds to pay for damages to the unit not to exceed 1 month's rent. You can only make that payment after the participant has already left the unit. They can't be resident in the unit, and you can't make that property damage payment to the participants. It is a one-time cost per participant. In the YHDP program, again, there are those special provisions that you need to request, but occasionally, you can request the opportunity to go up to 2 months' rent for these damages. But again, in order to do that, you must have gotten HUD approval for that special YHDP condition. And as I said, that only happens when the participant has already left the unit. If they're in the unit, you cannot pay that 1 month's rent for damages. Okay, we've got another Zoom poll. Rosa, if you could launch this one, I think this is going to be our last. And the questions are: participants always have the right to appeal a termination decision, true or false? If participant is in a nursing home for 100 days, we can use rental assistance funds to continue paying rent if they're there for 100 days. And we can use COC funds to pay for damages to 1 month's rent in addition to the security deposit. True or false on these questions? We'll give you a couple of moments to answer that. Okay, I think we got our responses in. So Rosa, if you could stop the poll and let's see the results. First one, yes, 100% got that correct. Participants always have the right to appeal a termination decision. Well done. If the person is in a nursing home for 100 days, we can use rental assistance to continue paying rent. The limitation is 90 days. So 100 days is 10 days too many. So no, you can only do it for 90 days. They have to be back in the unit within 90 days. We can provide COC funds to pay for damages up to one's rent in addition to the security deposit. That is correct. Again, remember that's only after the participant has left the units. Well done on that poll. And here are the answers for you. Okay, now in the unlikely event that we have not talked your ears off, and the last thing in the world you want in this lifetime is to hear us talking to you more about these HUD requirements, then we've got another one coming up in less than 2 weeks, close to Halloween. Folks are encouraged to wear costumes to this session if you would like. We're going to do a virtual trick or treat as well. I'm not exactly sure what that encompasses, but we'll figure it out in less than 2 weeks. But on this slide are the exciting things that we're going to be talking about for permanent supportive housing on the 28th of October. So again, gluttons for punishment, and people who really want to make sure they get this right, please consider joining us again in 13 days' time. This is, of course, as you know, we are privileged to not be the only entity that's providing some training and technical assistance to you. So we've got this link to other upcoming trainings that are going to be available through these series. And also, as Lorna pointed out earlier, these are all recorded. They're on the YouTube channel. This is a link to get you to all those trainings. And now we pause and ask whether there are any final questions or suggestions, or if anybody's awake. And to get assistance from our great colleagues at the Rhode Island Continuum of Care, this is Rosa and Sarah's email and phone number. So please feel free to reach out to them. And then finally, this is the information for us people at Housing Innovations. So feel free, as always, to reach out to us as well. We love working with you and hearing from you. Any other questions, any other discussion?
I have a quick question. So what would you say to a client that insists on, I guess, living in an apartment that you know they won't be able to afford after the program ends?
Anyone feel like jumping in? Lauren, do you feel like jumping in on this one? I mean, again, it's challenging. I mean, on the one hand, you want to offer folks choice. I mean, because that's what this really is all about. And you want them to make decisions on where it is that they want to live. Ideally, if it's a place where they really want to live, they may sacrifice more. They may work harder to be able to retain that thing. If they have to go to a place where they don't really want to go, the chances are they may be less likely to stay or be committed to that unit. So I think, what can you do? I mean, you basically try to explain what could go wrong, if that could be beyond their means. Tell them the assistance is not going to go on forever, but it is their choice. And if they choose that kind of a situation, then I think you want to honor that choice, always being mindful of the fact that there are risks involved for them. And I see you unmuted, Lauren. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. The only thing I would add is just, we might not always be aware of all the, opportunities that people have to make income and, or people in their lives who are willing to support them. So I think, advise about the risks and assume that people are in the best position to make decisions about their own lives. We may not have all the information.
Yep. Great. Thank you. And as I said, we're asking people to make sacrifices. They got to pay a lot of money for it. So it should be a place they want to be in. Any more questions? It looks like we may be able to give you about 15 minutes back to your day because we're wrapping up. So once again, as always, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. We'll be with you again soon. Really appreciate your time and attention and staying with us for this. As Lauren said at the outset, this is not the most fascinating material that you'll ever see in your life. So thank you for your indulgence while we provide it to you.
Sarah put the link for the evaluation. So we appreciate your feedback. So please fill that out. It's in the chat. Also, the content on the 28th is going to be really similar to today. So if you attended today, you may not want to also attend on the 28th, and it'll be recorded and posted. So you could always look at just any parts that are different than PSH. but a lot of it, rent calculation is the primary thing that's a little different in PSH.
Okay, I think it wraps up. Thanks so much. You folks are free to enjoy your day.
Thanks, everybody. It was good to see you.